At 4 minutes past 1 in the morning, while a city of 250,000 people slept, the ground beneath Granada moved with enough force to send people running into parks in their night clothes, too frightened to stay inside their own homes. Cornices peeled off buildings. Chunks of masonry crashed into empty streets. Emergency lines lit up with more than 200 calls before dawn. And the shaking was felt not just in Granada, but across 367 towns in 10 different provinces, all the way to Madrid. But here is the thing that stopped me cold when I looked at the data, and it's the reason you need to stay with me to the end of this. That magnitude 5 earthquake did not come out of nowhere. It announced itself. Hours before it struck, the earth was already whispering warnings in a language most people never notice, and whether those whispers have now gone quiet, or whether they were the opening act of something larger, is the question I still cannot fully answer. Subscribe, because when the ground beneath a city like this starts moving in a sequence, you want to see how it ends. Let me show you what the earth was doing before anyone woke up, because that's the part that should worry you more than the earthquake itself. When a moderate quake strikes a populated region, the natural instinct is to ask how bad the damage was and then move on. But seismologists ask a different question, one that's far more unsettling. Was that the main event, or was it a foreshock? And in Granada's case, there's a second problem hiding underneath the first. This is not a region with one giant, obvious fault you can point to on a map. It's a tangle of them, a hidden network of fractures beneath a densely populated basin, any one of which could be the culprit, and none of which has yet been confidently identified as the one that broke. So we have two mysteries pulling in the same direction. Is the sequence finished? And which fault exactly are we even watching? Hold both of those in your mind, because the story of how this began makes both of them stranger. It started on Friday morning, quietly, in a way almost no one would have registered. At 8:39 local time, Spain's National Geographic Institute, the IGN, the agency that watches the country's seismic pulse, logged a tiny magnitude 1.9 southeast of a town called Gojar. On its own, nothing. The Iberian Peninsula records small tremors like this all the time. You could work directly above one and never feel it. But keep your eye on that spot on the map, because the Earth wasn't done there. By Friday evening, the whisper got louder. At 6:43 p.m., a magnitude 3.7 struck northwest of a village called Alhendín, and this one people felt intensity 4 on the scale, enough to rattle windows and stop conversations mid-sentence. And here's the detail that matters more than the number. That earthquake hit only about 2 miles from where the big one would strike hours later, almost the same patch of ground. Then, at 8:30 that evening, a magnitude 2.2 near another nearby town. Then, at 4 minutes past midnight, a 2.3. And then, watch the clock here. At exactly 4 minutes past 1 in the morning, precisely 1 hour after that midnight tremor, the Earth let go with everything it had been holding back. The IGN first put the main shock at magnitude 4.8. Within hours, they revised it upward to magnitude 5.0. The United States Geological Survey, reviewing the same event with its own methods, placed it slightly higher at 5.2. And that small discrepancy, 5.0 versus 5.2, is not a mistake or a contradiction. Different agencies use different instruments, different formulas, different assumptions, and they routinely land a couple of tenths apart on the same quake. But that gap tells you something important that we'll come back to. Even the location these agencies calculate can differ by several miles, and when you're trying to figure out which buried fault actually moved, a few miles is the difference between one answer and another. Now, I want to slow down on the magnitudes, because there's a trap here that fools almost everyone. When you read that sequence, 3.7, then 2.2, then 2.3, then 5.0, the 3.7 sounds like it's in the same neighborhood as the main shock. It isn't, not even close. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, which means each step up isn't a small increase. It's a leap. Using standard earthquake energy scaling, a magnitude 5.0 doesn't release a little more energy than a 3.7. It releases something on the order of 100 times more. Whatever ruptured at 1:04 in the morning unleashed vastly more force than everything that came before it in this sequence, combined. Those earlier tremors weren't warm-ups of similar size. They were faint pressure cracks before the real break. And that raises the obvious, chilling question. If the small ones were the prelude, what was the 5.0 the prelude to? Because in the minutes after it struck, the map didn't calm down. It caught fire. 4 minutes after the main shock, a 2.1. 2 minutes after that, a 2.6. Then a 2.0, then more, scattered across a cluster of villages ringing the city. Armilla, Alhendín, Gojar, and their neighbors, one after another through the darkness. By the time the sun came up, the IGN had logged more than 40 aftershocks in that single night around Granada and its metropolitan area. 40 tremors while people were trying to sleep, or more accurately, while people had given up on sleep entirely and gathered in parks and open squares Because when the ground keeps moving, the last place you want to be is under a roof. But before you let that number, 40 aftershocks, spike your fear, I have to give you a piece of context that changes how you should read it, and it's the kind of thing that separates panic from understanding. A high count of aftershocks does not, by itself, mean the situation is escalating. In fact, counting the dots on an earthquake map is one of the easiest ways to mislead yourself. Here's why. After magnitude 5, a swarm of small aftershocks is exactly what you'd expect. It's the fault settling, releasing leftover stress in small increments. Dozens of tiny tremors can actually be a sign of a system calming down, not winding up. What matters isn't how many, it's how big and where. And for the first several hours after the main shock, the answer to how big was reassuring. The largest aftershock stayed small, nothing that came close to the 5.0. Compare that to the enormous magnitude 7.7 that struck Indonesia on this very same weekend, where the first aftershocks were themselves in the magnitude 6 range, powerful enough to be major earthquakes on their own. Granada's aftershocks, by contrast, were staying quiet. The ground kept twitching, but gently. And then, hours later, something shifted. Well, after the main shock, a new tremor climbed back above magnitude 3. Not catastrophic, not even alarming on its own. An aftershock in that range following a magnitude 5 is completely ordinary. And I want to be precise about that so nobody watching this spirals into fear. Take a breath. This is normal. But it is also useful information, and here's the subtle reason why. After a long stretch dominated by nothing but 1s and 2s, the sequence had just produced another event above magnitude 3. So the question stopped being, is it over, in the simple sense? The question became sharper, what happens after that magnitude 3? Do the numbers keep climbing toward 4? Do they fall back into the noise? And this is the one the scientists care about most. Do the earthquakes stay locked in that same tight cluster of villages, or do they start to travel? Because a migrating sequence, one where the epicenters march along a line over time, can be a sign that a fault is unzipping, rupturing progressively across a longer stretch. That single detail, do they stay put or do they move, is one of the clearest early signals of where a sequence is headed. And it's exactly the thing we're still watching. Which means the answer to my opening question is still, at this point, genuinely open. So let's leave the underground for a moment and go up to the surface where the consequences are no longer a matter of speculation. The earthquake was felt across a staggering area. 367 towns reported the shaking, spread from Granada itself through Málaga, Jaén, Córdoba, Almería, and reaching all the way to Madrid, Murcia, and beyond. This is a part of Spain I've spent time in, Andalusia, and it's one of the most beautiful regions in Europe, which makes the images coming out of it all the harder to look at, because they're the kind of images you usually associate with somewhere else, not southern Spain. Emergency services fielded more than 200 calls. People described cracks opening in walls, cornices breaking loose, cascades of plaster and pieces of facade tumbling into the streets of the metropolitan area, with material damage reported in towns like Armilla. Firefighters and police fanned out to inspect and secure the affected zones. At least one residential building was evacuated as a precaution, while engineers assessed whether the damage was cosmetic or structural. But here's the number that matters most, and I don't say it lightly. As of the latest reporting, no casualties, no deaths, no serious injuries. The Andalusian regional government activated the emergency phase of its seismic risk plan, a formal escalation that tells you authorities took this seriously. And yet, the earthquake, for all its power, did not produce the kind of widespread structural collapse that defines a true catastrophe. It damaged the vulnerable elements of buildings. It did not bring the buildings down. And that distinction is the whole difference between a frightening night and a funeral. So let me explain what stood between Granada and something far worse. Part of the answer is a concept that gets confused constantly. So let me show you what it looks like, rather than just define it. Imagine two identical earthquakes releasing exactly the same amount of energy. One happens 30 miles underground. The other happens 2 miles underground, right beneath your feet. The deep one might barely rattle a window. The shallow one can crack your walls. Same magnitude, completely different experience. That's the difference between magnitude and intensity. Magnitude measures the earthquake itself, the raw energy released at the source, and it's a single fixed number. Intensity measures what the shaking actually does to a specific place, and it changes depending on how close you are and how deep the quake was. Granada's earthquake registered strong shaking, intensity in the range of 5 to 6 near the epicenter. And it was shallow, striking at a depth of just 2 kilometers by the IGN's measurement. Shallow and strong is a dangerous combination. The fact that it caused damage but not collapse tells you something about both the earthquake's size and the buildings that absorbed it. And it raises the question every seismologist asks next. Why here? Why does this particular corner of Spain shake at all? Because most people don't think of Spain as earthquake country. And that instinct is exactly what makes this story worth understanding. Granada sits in one of the most seismically significant parts of the entire Iberian Peninsula, and the reason is a slow, grinding collision happening far beneath the Mediterranean. The African plate, geologists call it the Nubian plate, is pushing northward against the Eurasian plate, and southern Spain is caught in the broad zone of crumpling and cracking that collision creates. But, and this is the key, it doesn't behave the way California does. There's no single, dramatic, San Andreas-style gash slicing visibly across the landscape. One obvious boundary you can trace with your finger. Around Granada, the strain is smeared across a complicated web of faults. A whole network of fractures riddling the ground beneath the Granada Basin. Some of them slip vertically, some sideways, some thrust one block over another. And that complexity is precisely why the second mystery I opened at the start is so hard to solve. Because when this earthquake struck near Alhendín, it struck in a neighborhood of faults, not on a lone, clearly labeled one. The area sits close to the Granada fault system, and farther south lies another network known as the Padul-Nigueles fault system. Geological studies of this region have shown that faults here have the physical dimensions to produce earthquakes in the magnitude 6 range. Now stop, because that sentence is dangerously easy to misread, and I refuse to let it become a scare headline. That figure describes the long-term capability of these faults over geological time. It does not mean today's magnitude 5 is about to grow into a magnitude 6. It does not mean this swarm is fated to escalate. And crucially, it does not yet tell us which individual fault produced Saturday's earthquake. Right now, I'd be deeply skeptical of anyone confidently drawing a single red line on a map and announcing, this is the fault. We don't have that confirmation. Remember that gap between the European and American location estimates, several miles apart? That gap is exactly why pinning the blame on one specific fracture this soon would be a guess dressed up as a fact. But if you want to understand what these faults are truly capable of, you don't have to speculate. You just have to look at the history. And the history of this exact region is far more violent than its peaceful modern reputation suggests. In the year 1431, an earthquake struck south of Granada estimated at around magnitude 6.7, powerful enough to reach intensity 8 to 9 and cause major damage, including damage to the Alhambra itself, the breathtaking Moorish palace complex that is arguably the most important historic building in the country. I've stood inside it. It's the kind of place that makes you go quiet. And the earth once shook it hard enough to break it. Then there's the one that haunts this region's memory more than any other, and it happened on a day that makes it almost unbearable to think about. Christmas Day, 1884. The Arenas del Rey earthquake, estimated at roughly magnitude 6.5, with shaking that reached intensity 9 to 10, near the very top of the scale. Historical accounts put the death toll at around 839 people. Thousands of buildings destroyed, many thousands more damaged. On Christmas Day, in this same seismic zone, in an era when the region was far less populated than it is now. Let that comparison sink in for a second. Today, hundreds of thousands of people live packed into the Granada metropolitan area. And the faults beneath them have, in living geological memory, produced earthquakes not just a little larger than Saturday's, but 100 times more powerful. This is not a forecast. Nothing about the magnitude 5 means another 1884 is coming, but 1884 is proof, carved into the historical record in stone and in names, that the ground here is capable of far, far more than what it did this weekend. And this is exactly where the story circles back to the question I've kept open since the first sentence, because there's one more comparison, and it's the most relevant of all, not from centuries ago, but from just 5 years back. If you lived around Granada in the winter of 2020 and into 2021, you remember this. And if you were there, I genuinely want you to tell me in the comments what those weeks were like, because the data can't capture what it feels like to live through it. In late 2020 and early 2021, the area around the towns of Santa Fe and Atarfe in the same Granada Basin produced something extraordinary. An earthquake swarm that didn't last hours or days, but weeks. When scientists later reconstructed it in detail, they counted more than 5,000 individual earthquakes, including 6 that exceeded magnitude 4. For weeks, people lived inside a ground that would not stop shivering, watching tremor after tremor ripple across the basin, one after another after another. It was, in the truest sense, a swarm, not a single main shock followed by fading aftershocks, but a prolonged, restless barrage. So now you can feel the full weight of the question. Is what we're seeing right now the beginning of another 2021? A long, grinding swarm that could rumble on for weeks and produce more magnitude 4s? Or is Saturday's magnitude 5 the peak, the main event, with the ground now slowly settling back into silence? And here, at last, in the final stretch, I can give you the honest answer, because the honest answer is the only one worth having. The truthful resolution is this: the two events are not the same, and it would be a mistake to assume Granada is simply repeating 2021. The differences are real, and they matter. The largest earthquake in the entire 2021 swarm was a magnitude 4.4. Saturday's main shock, at magnitude 5.0 to 5.2, was already larger than anything that swarm produced across 5,000 tremors. The location is different, the likely fault geometry is different, and critically, the character is different too. 2021 was a swarm from the start, a democracy of similar-sized quakes with no clear leader, whereas this sequence has a single dominant event towering over everything around it. That's the signature of a main shock and aftershock sequence, which typically fades rather than an open-ended swarm, which can persist. So the most probable reading, and I want to be clear, this is an interpretation of the pattern, not a guarantee, is that the magnitude 5 was the main shock, and the smaller tremors following it are aftershocks that should, over the coming days and weeks, gradually decline in both size and frequency. That is the likeliest path. But, and this is the part that keeps me watching the live feed instead of closing the laptop, likely is not certain, and the Earth has never signed a contract with us. A larger earthquake remains possible. It's less probable after a main shock than before one, but the faults here are capable of more, and every one of those small aftershocks is still, technically, the fault adjusting itself in ways we can only partly predict. So even as the big question resolves toward probably the peak, a smaller, sharper one takes its place, and it's the one that actually matters for the people sleeping in those parks tonight. Over the next week, do the aftershocks fade the way the odds say they should, or does the ground surprise us? And that, in the end, is the quiet truth about living on a restless planet, whether you're in Granada, or Tokyo, or California, or anywhere the plates grind against each other beneath your feet. We cannot predict the exact day or hour a fault will break. What we can do is read the warnings the Earth leaves, the foreshocks, the swarms, the historical scars like 1884, and use them not to panic, but to prepare. Granada was lucky this time. A shallow, strong earthquake struck a densely populated region in the dead of night and, remarkably, took no lives. The buildings held. The warning systems worked. The people knew to get outside. But luck is not a strategy. And the same faults that spared the city on Saturday are the ones that once cracked the Alhambra and darkened a Christmas morning with hundreds of dead. The ground beneath Granada is old and complicated and patient. It has spoken before. This week, it spoke again. And the wisest thing any of us can do is keep listening. If you found this useful, do me a favor and let me know in the comments whether you'd want a full breakdown of how scientists tell a fading aftershock sequence apart from a building swarm in real time, because that's the exact detective work happening beneath Granada right now, and I'll make it if enough of you want it. Give this a like if it helped you understand what's actually going on down there. Subscribe to W for weather so you're with me when the next update comes. And above all, if you're in Andalusia tonight, stay safe, stay outside if you need to, and trust the people whose job it is to watch the ground.